On February 3rd, 2026, NATO quietly confirmed that it had begun formal military planning for an Arctic mission explicitly linked to rising strategic pressure around Greenland. There was no press conference, no emergency summit, no declaration of intent, just a short confirmation buried beneath louder global headlines. The following day, new climate data showed that Greenland had broken long-standing temperature records, accelerating environmental conditions that could make mining, shipping, and infrastructure development feasible far sooner than previously projected. On the surface, nothing seemed urgent. No troops were deployed, no territory changed hands, no treaty was signed. And yet, within days, defense planners, insurers, logistics firms, and mineral investors began quietly adjusting assumptions about security coverage, transport routes, and long-term access to strategic resources. This was not framed as a crisis. It wasn't even framed as a decision. But it marked a moment when planning moved ahead of politics, and expectations began forming without public debate. If this mattered, it raised an uncomfortable question. Why did something with potential alliance, economic, and security implications barely register at all? At first glance, this looks like a story about Greenland, or climate change, or NATO updating contingency plans in a region most people never think about. That framing is misleading. This isn't primarily about Arctic ice or minerals or even territorial disputes. It's about how strategic realities form before anyone formally agrees they exist. What changed in early 2026 wasn't ownership or control. It was expectation. NATO planning doesn't create policy, but it shapes assumptions. Markets don't wait for treaties, but they respond to signals. And once enough institutions begin acting as if a future security posture will exist, that posture starts to become difficult to unwind. This is not escalation in the traditional sense. There are no ultimatums, no deadlines. Instead, this is a slow reclassification. Greenland shifting from peripheral territory to strategic node, not through announcement, but through accumulation. The real shift isn't military, it's institutional. And that's why the story doesn't feel dramatic. There's no moment to protest, no vote to track, no clear line crossed. By the time the consequences become visible, the assumptions behind them may already be locked in. What we're watching can be described as the Arctic optionality trap. Optionality sounds safe. It implies flexibility, hedging, and keeping choices open. But under certain conditions, optionality can become a constraint rather than a freedom. The Arctic optionality trap emerges when multiple systems, security planning, climate change, capital markets, and alliance politics begin moving in anticipation of future necessity rather than present demand. No single actor decides the outcome. Each behaves rationally within their own domain. Defense planners prepare contingencies. Investors seek first-mover advantage. Governments avoid premature commitments. Allies delay difficult conversations. Individually, these actions reduce risk. Collectively, they create it. The trap forms because once planning assumptions spread across institutions, reversing course becomes costly, even if political priorities later change. Infrastructure is designed, contracts are priced, risk models adjust, careers and budgets align. At that point, optionality narrows. The metaphor is simple. It's like building the scaffolding of a building before deciding what the building is for. Once the scaffolding is up, removing it feels like regression, even if the foundation was never agreed upon. Greenland sits at the center of this dynamic, not because of what it produces today, but because of what multiple systems expect it might produce tomorrow. Climate trends suggest access. Security planners anticipate exposure. Markets price future protection. Politics avoids naming the trade-offs. The danger isn't conflict, it's misalignment. If expectations harden faster than coordination, alliances face stress not from hostility, but from ambiguity. If capital moves ahead of governance, economic pressure builds without accountability. And if strategic assumptions go unspoken long enough, they eventually stop feeling like assumptions at all. That's how regions become strategic without a declaration, and how choices disappear without anyone officially making them. To understand why this issue matters, you have to look beneath the visible events, not at speeches or headlines or official statements, but at the structures that quietly shape behavior long before outcomes appear. Start with economics. Greenland's minerals are not yet central to global supply. What matters is not current output, but future expectation. Critical minerals, rare earths, nickel, cobalt, are inputs for electric vehicles, defense systems, power grids, and advanced electronics. These are sectors where demand is expected to grow regardless of short-term cycles. When climate data suggests access may come sooner, supply chain models begin adjusting, not officially, quietly. Corporations start asking different questions. Which routes might be viable? Which jurisdictions are politically stable? Which security arrangements are assumed, even if not guaranteed? Those questions affect pricing long before extraction begins. Insurance premiums shift, financing costs change. Long-term contracts are modeled with wider margins for uncertainty. None of this requires public policy. It happens because risk managers are paid to think ahead, not wait for clarity. That's the first invisible structure. Markets moving on probability, not permission. The second structure is political, but not ideological. Greenland sits within a layered governance system. Local autonomy, Danish sovereignty, NATO security frameworks, and US alliance leadership. Each layer has veto points. Each moves at a different speed. Domestic politics in the United States reward decisiveness and leverage. Alliance institutions reward caution and consensus. Local governance rewards protection of autonomy and long-term benefits. No layer is malfunctioning. They're simply misaligned in time. This creates a vacuum where nobody wants to be the first to define limits. So ambiguity persists. Not as a strategy, but as a byproduct. And ambiguity invites projection. Each actor fills the gap with their own assumptions. Over time, those assumptions harden. The third structure is capital itself. Large-scale mining and Arctic infrastructure are not financed incrementally. They require massive upfront commitments with decades-long horizons. Investors won't move without some expectation of stability, political, legal, and physical. NATO planning doesn't guarantee that stability, but it signals intent. Enough intent to lower perceived risk, just enough for early-stage capital to explore, secure options, and position assets. This creates a quiet asymmetry. Publicly, governments insist no decisions have been made. Privately, balance sheets begin acting as if some outcomes are more likely than others. Once that gap opens, politics starts reacting to capital rather than guiding it. The fourth structure is alliance psychology. Alliances depend less on formal rules than on shared expectations. When expectations diverge about burden sharing, sovereignty sensitivity, or acceptable pressure tactics, trust erodes without a single breach. In the Arctic context, even subtle signals matter. A planning document here, a rhetorical slip there, a delayed consultation. None are decisive alone. But together, they shape how allies interpret intent. And when allies start planning defensively against each other's unpredictability, coordination slows. That slowdown doesn't look like conflict. It looks like delay. Delay in approvals, delay in funding, delay in shared doctrine. Ironically, delay increases the appeal of unilateral or informal solutions, which further stress alliance norms. The fifth structure is climate itself, not as an environmental story, but as a timing accelerator. Climate change doesn't just alter geography, it alters decision windows. Routes that were theoretical become plausible. Resources that were unreachable become investable. Timelines compress. Institutions, however, are not designed to accelerate smoothly. They respond in steps. Elections, budget cycles, legal reviews all introduce friction. When physical reality moves faster than institutional adaptation, planning shifts from strategic to reactive. Not because leaders panic, but because they are trying to catch up. That's how risk accumulates without drama. None of these structures are malicious. None require conspiracy. Each follows its own internal logic. This is why the Greenland issue feels intangible but persistent, why it resists headlines yet keeps resurfacing in planning rooms, why it affects prices and expectations without ever announcing itself. The invisible structure isn't a plot. It's alignment without coordination. And once enough systems align on an unspoken future, choosing a different one becomes far harder than it looks. What makes this situation dangerous is not that it escalates quickly, but that it escalates without announcing itself. In the early phase, nothing dramatic changes. Planning continues in conference rooms rather than on maps. NATO refines Arctic scenarios that are framed as defensive, precautionary, and technical. Governments repeat that no decisions have been made. Greenland remains legally unchanged. Public attention stays elsewhere. Yet beneath that surface, behavior begins to shift. Investors treat Arctic access as more plausible than before. Logistics firms quietly model new routes. Insurance companies revise risk tables. None of this is visible enough to provoke reaction, but it changes incentives. Once assumptions move, reversing them requires justification. Doing nothing starts to look like neglect rather than caution. As months pass, this quiet normalization deepens. What was once described as contingency planning becomes baseline expectation. Budget discussions start including Arctic considerations as routine line items rather than exceptional cases. Not because leaders intend escalation, but because planning inertia rewards continuity. It is easier to extend an existing assumption than to question it. At this stage, the beneficiaries are subtle. Early movers in logistics, mining exploration, and advisory services gain positioning advantages. Defense planners gain optionality without accountability. Political leaders benefit from ambiguity because it postpones hard conversations. Meanwhile, the costs are dispersed. Allies feel mild discomfort but lack a clear reason to object, and markets absorb uncertainty through small price adjustments that no one traces back to Greenland. The next phase doesn't arrive with a trigger. It arrives when economics begins to outweigh diplomacy. Capital, once it starts moving, demands predictability. Projects require timelines. Timelines require coordination. Coordination requires decisions that were previously deferred. Ports, airstrips, communications infrastructure, and environmental approvals begin to appear on planning agendas. Each is justified individually. Together, they imply permanence. At this point, alliance tension becomes more visible, not as conflict, but as friction. Denmark faces growing pressure to balance sovereignty, domestic politics, and alliance expectations. Greenlandic autonomy becomes harder to separate from strategic calculations made elsewhere. Other NATO members quietly ask what obligations they are assuming without having debated them. No one wants to force clarity because clarity creates winners and losers. Ambiguity still feels safer, but ambiguity is now costly. Delays increase expenses. Uncertainty slows coordination. Some firms begin hedging by maintaining exposure to existing supply chains, including those dominated by China, undermining diversification goals. This is where external actors benefit indirectly. Russia and China do not need to intervene overtly. The system rewards patience. Any delay among allies preserves existing leverage. Any friction amplifies doubt about Western coordination. The advantage is not control, but optionality, the same dynamic NATO sought for itself. As this phase stretches on, political narratives begin to shift. What was once technical becomes symbolic. Questions about burden sharing, sovereignty sensitivity, and strategic seriousness enter domestic debates. Positions harden not because facts changed, but because accumulated ambiguity invites interpretation. The escalation now becomes institutional. Budgets reflect assumptions. Career paths align around Arctic expertise. Procurement timelines stretch years into the future. Reversing course would require admitting that earlier planning was premature. Institutions rarely do that voluntarily. By this point, even restraint carries risk. Choosing not to proceed can be framed as weakness or indecision. Proceeding locks in commitments that were never publicly debated. The system narrows choices regardless of intent. In the long run, the issue stops being about Greenland at all. It becomes about credibility. If alliances appear unable to coordinate around emerging strategic spaces, confidence erodes not only in the Arctic but elsewhere. Other regions become harder to stabilize. Other commitments become easier to question. At the same time, households and businesses feel secondary effects. Prices remain higher than expected. Investment cycles become uneven. Security spending competes with social priorities. None of these pressures cause immediate crisis, but they reduce resilience when shocks arrive from other directions. The most dangerous moment comes not from confrontation, but from collision. A crisis elsewhere, a conflict escalation, a trade shock, an energy disruption forces attention back to the Arctic under worse conditions. Assets that were planned as optional become operational necessities. Decisions that could have been phased are rushed. Misunderstandings harden into positions. At that stage, the system behaves as if escalation was inevitable, even though no single actor ever chose it. That is the core risk of this ladder. Each step feels reasonable in isolation. Each delay feels prudent at the time. Each assumption feels reversible until it isn't. And because escalation happens through alignment rather than aggression, responsibility is diffused. There is no moment to point to, no speech to replay, no document that declares intent. Only a gradual realization that the strategic environment has changed and that adapting to it now costs far more than it would have earlier. This is how quiet issues become structural ones, not through crisis, but through accumulation. History rarely repeats itself cleanly, but it often echoes in structure. One useful mirror comes from the early decades of Arctic governance around Svalbard in the 20th century. At the time, it looked like a remote legal arrangement, treaties about mining rights, research access, and neutrality. No one framed it as a major security issue. And yet, over time, shifting technology, changing climate conditions, and rising great power competition transformed those technical agreements into strategic constraints. What mattered wasn't a single decision, but the fact that early ambiguity hardened into precedent. Another echo comes from the early stages of the South China Sea disputes, long before militarization dominated headlines. In the 1990s, most activity was described as scientific, commercial, or defensive. Infrastructure appeared incrementally. Planning documents accumulated. Assumptions spread faster than diplomacy. By the time regional actors realized that strategic facts had been created, reversing them required confrontation rather than coordination. Greenland does not face contested sovereignty in the same way. That difference matters. But the structural similarity lies elsewhere in how incremental normalization reshapes strategic environments without ever triggering alarm. A third, quieter mirror comes from the North Sea energy boom among NATO allies. Oil and gas development initially looked like a technical economic story. Over time, it reshaped defense priorities, alliance coordination, and domestic politics. Markets moved faster than institutions. Governments found themselves reacting to capital commitments already made. The uncomfortable lesson across these cases is not inevitability, but timing. Institutions tend to respond after assumptions have already formed. Once economic and strategic expectations align, politics often arrives late. These analogies are imperfect because today's environment adds two accelerants history did not face simultaneously: climate change, compressing timelines, and domestic political polarization shaping alliance behavior. The past does not predict the future here. It warns how easily slow processes outrun deliberate decision-making. History's value isn't telling us what will happen. It shows how often outcomes emerge not from choice, but from drift. For most people, this story never feels personal at first. No one wakes up thinking about Greenland. No family budget line item mentions Arctic security. And yet the effects filter down quietly through prices, jobs, and long-term stability. For middle-class households, the pressure shows up as persistence. Prices don't spike dramatically, but they stay higher than expected. Goods tied to energy, transportation, electronics, and vehicles reflect the cost of uncertain supply chains and delayed diversification. Life doesn't collapse. It just feels harder to plan. For retirees, the concern is erosion rather than shock. Fixed incomes depend on stable prices and predictable returns. When markets become more volatile and inflation remains uneven, even small deviations compound. The risk isn't losing everything. It's losing confidence that savings will stretch as far as planned. Small businesses feel this first. They lack buffers. Higher insurance costs, shipping uncertainty, and delayed infrastructure decisions squeeze margins quickly. Expansion plans pause. Hiring slows, not because demand disappears, but because uncertainty makes risk harder to justify. For younger workers, the picture is mixed. New opportunities emerge in logistics, climate science, engineering, security technology, and infrastructure. But these jobs are often project-based, politically sensitive, and unevenly distributed. Career paths become less linear. Adaptability matters more than stability. Across all groups, the common thread is not crisis, but fragility. Systems still function, but they feel tighter, less forgiving, more exposed to external shocks. This is how geopolitics reaches the household level, not as drama, but as reduced margin for error. The most unsettling part of this story is that nothing has gone wrong. There is no war in the Arctic, no treaty collapse, no emergency summit. Institutions are functioning, markets are operating, alliances still exist, and yet the rules are quietly changing. When planning moves faster than politics, when capital outruns governance, and when ambiguity becomes embedded rather than resolved, systems lose flexibility without realizing it. The danger isn't escalation, it's commitment without consent. At some point, decisions will have to be made about sovereignty sensitivity, about alliance boundaries, about how much uncertainty societies are willing to absorb in exchange for optionality. But those decisions may arrive under worse conditions than today, during a crisis elsewhere, during an economic downturn, during a political transition. By then, the cost of clarity will be higher. This is how strategic environments shift. Not through dramatic breaks, but through accumulated assumptions that narrow future choices. When people finally ask, how did we get here? The answer is usually disappointing. We didn't get here through a single mistake. We got here by postponing alignment. If you want to understand what's coming before it becomes obvious, not when it's already priced in, debated, and locked into institutions, then this is the kind of story worth paying attention to, not because it demands panic, but because it explains why the world can feel more expensive, more tense, and less predictable, even when nothing seems obviously wrong. And because once these shifts become visible, they are rarely new anymore.